You wake up and reach for your phone before your feet touch the floor. Nothing. No missed calls, no messages, no reason to reply late. You scroll out of habit, not hope, and see photos of dinners, birthdays, group chats, inside jokes you were never part of. Your chest feels heavy, not jealous, just hollow, like something important slipped out overnight without asking permission. This silence is specific. It doesn't feel dramatic or tragic. It feels dull, persistent, and personal. Society rushes to label it. They say you are antisocial, emotionally unavailable, broken in some quiet way. They imply the problem is you, but that explanation never fully lands. You can talk to people. You can show up. You can listen. And yet, connection keeps dissolving before it forms. It leaves behind a question you can't shake. What am I missing? You don't feel superior. You don't feel special. You don't even feel angry. You just feel out of sync, like everyone else received a manual you never saw. At work, you're polite but distant. In conversations, you sense when something is off, but you can't name it without sounding strange. So you stay quiet. Over time, invitations slow, then stop. No argument, no fallout, just absence. That's what hurts most. Not rejection, but erasure. Loneliness doesn't shout, it corrodes. You weren't rejected loudly, you were excluded quietly. And the hardest part is not being alone. It's not knowing why it keeps happening, or whether fixing it means becoming someone you don't recognize anymore. You start wondering if the emptiness is a warning or a signal you keep misreading, and whether chasing belonging will cost you clarity, self-respect, and the quiet sense that something here still deserves to be understood before you rush to erase it completely for good. The first lie you need to drop is that having few friends automatically means something is wrong with you. That belief sounds moral, but it is actually social conditioning. Machiavelli understood this long before psychology gave it clean language. He observed that crowds reward compliance, not clarity, and punish those who disturb the emotional balance of the group. Some personalities do not fail at belonging, they quietly opt out of it. Not everyone is designed to move in herds. Sheep survive by numbers, by blending, by making noise together. Apex animals survive by awareness, by distance, by selective engagement. The strongest creature in an ecosystem is rarely the most social one. This pattern shows up everywhere, not just in nature. In offices, the loudest table is not where the real decisions happen. In social circles, the most connected person is often the most replaceable. Belonging is not proof of health. It is proof of compatibility with a specific environment. Some systems require conformity to function, others require precision. If your mind questions too much, senses tension too early, or resists emotional consensus, crowds will feel draining instead of comforting. That does not make you defective. It means your psychology is misaligned with mass behavior. Think of the engineer who leaves happy hour early to finish a design, or the entrepreneur who skips group chats to think through risk. They are not antisocial. They are selective. Some minds don't survive in crowds, not because they are weak, but because they operate on different incentives. Once you see this, the shame begins to loosen. You stop asking how to fit in and start asking where you actually belong, which is the first shift that changes everything. This reframing opens the door to understanding your isolation without immediately trying to cure it prematurely. Before we break down the patterns, you need to understand the common thread that connects people who end up with very small circles. It is not personality, not trauma, not social skill. It is perception. Your brain processes reality differently, and that difference creates friction long before conflict ever appears. Most people experience social life as relief. Conversation relaxes them. Noise distracts them from their own thoughts. For you, the same environment creates overload. Your mind does not shut off to bond. It scans, it compares, it notices gaps between words and behavior automatically. This is why parties exhaust you. While others loosen up, you tighten internally, tracking tone changes, inconsistencies, forced laughter. You are not anxious. You are processing too much data at once. People with few friends often share this wiring. They recognize patterns quickly, reject artificial behavior instinctively, and feel drained by meaningless interaction. When someone says they support you but disappears when it matters, your body registers it immediately. When praise sounds warm but feels empty, you sense it without needing proof. That sensitivity makes social spaces feel noisy, even when nothing is technically wrong. For most people, socializing is rest. For you, it's labor. Think about a work meeting where everyone chats casually while you sit quiet, already predicting how the conversation will end. Or a group dinner where jokes fly, but you leave feeling tired instead of connected. This is not because you lack empathy. It is because your brain is constantly running quality control. Once you see this, isolation stops feeling like a personal failure and starts looking like a side effect. You are not alone in this experience, even if it feels that way. Comment. I feel this, if this already sounds uncomfortably familiar, because the next step is naming the patterns without judging them. That clarity creates relief before change, because understanding always precedes choice. And once you recognize the mechanism at work, you stop forcing connection, stop chasing approval, and start conserving energy for environments that don't require you to shrink, pretend, or numb your perception. This shift sets the stage for what comes next and explains your recurring patterns. Now we move into the core of this video. Not theories, not labels, not motivational fluff. What follows are 5 psychological patterns that repeatedly show up in people whose circles shrink over time. These patterns explain why connection feels heavy, why crowds drain you, and why solitude keeps choosing you. Read them slowly. Don't defend yourself. Don't romanticize them. Just observe. Because once you can see the pattern, you can decide what to do with it from this moment forward. Pattern 1 is painful because it turns you into the problem without you ever trying to be. People call you intense, judgy, or hard to read, not because you attack them, but because your brain refuses to accept words without checking behavior. This process is automatic. You notice micro-expressions before you notice sentences. You feel timing shifts before you hear explanations. When someone compliments you but their eyes stay flat, your body registers envy. When a coworker agrees with you but their voice jumps half a note, you sense hesitation. You are not paranoid. You are calibrated. Most people can ignore these signals because it makes social life easier. You can't. Your mind keeps running comparisons in the background, matching what is said to what is done, what is promised to what is repeated. At a party, others relax into the performance. You feel the tension of watching people manage impressions, suppress reactions, and adjust masks in real time. That awareness makes pretending feel dishonest. So you speak less. You observe more, and people feel it. Silence makes them uneasy because it removes their feedback loop. They can't tell if the act is working. This is why you're labeled difficult. Not because you criticize, but because you don't participate in collective self-deception. Think about the friend who praised your ambition when you were struggling, then pulled back when you started succeeding. Or the manager who said they valued honesty, then punished you the first time you told the truth calmly. You didn't lose those relationships through conflict. You exposed the mismatch between image and reality. That exposure is uncomfortable for people who rely on appearances to feel safe. So they distance themselves and rewrite the story. You're intense, you're cold, you're reading too much into things. But the pattern stays consistent. You cannot unsee what you see. This trait makes shallow connection impossible, but it protects you from deeper harm, and as it keeps you from investing in people whose actions won't support you when pressure arrives. You don't lose friends. You expose inconsistencies. And once that happens, the social stage collapses. This is where your circle starts shrinking, not because you pushed people away, but because you stopped lying to yourself about what you were watching. This is also why advice like, be more open or relax, never works for you. Openness without discernment feels unsafe. Relaxation without truth feels like sedation. You may have noticed this pattern early, maybe as a kid watching adults say one thing and do another, or later realizing friendships dissolved when you stopped accommodating. Over time, your nervous system learned one rule: trust behavior over language. That rule costs popularity, but preserves safety. And it also explains why your circle shrinks quietly and prepares you for the next pattern, where this awareness creates distance naturally. Pattern 2 hurts in a quieter way because it drains you without leaving a visible wound. Small talk doesn't annoy you, it exhausts you. You leave social situations feeling like someone skimmed minutes off your life without asking. This is not impatience, it is wiring. Psychologists call it a high need for cognition, but lived experience is simpler. Your brain feeds on ideas, trajectories, and meaning. When conversation stays stuck on weather, office drama, or recycled complaints, your system feels starved. At a dinner party, others unwind by repeating familiar stories. You sit there listening, already predicting the punchlines, already sensing how nothing new will enter the room. When you try to lift the conversation, to ask about the future, a belief, a risk someone is taking, the energy shifts. Someone laughs, someone changes the subject, someone reaches for their phone. The message is subtle but clear. Depth is inconvenient, so you learn to stop trying. This is where the loneliness deepens. You are surrounded by voices, yet nothing connects. Over time, your body learns an equation. Interaction equals depletion. Silence equals recovery. Think of the coworker who talks for 10 minutes about their weekend but shows no curiosity when you mention an idea you are building. Or the friend who wants company, not conversation, presence, not exchange. You are not cold for pulling back. You are conserving a finite resource. Time is not neutral to you. It feels physical. Wasted minutes register like loss. And this is where a Machiavellian instinct quietly appears. You begin to separate signal from noise. Not every conversation deserves your energy. Not every invitation deserves your attendance. Most people spend attention freely because they believe it is renewable. You learned early that it is not. That awareness makes you selective, and selectivity looks like distance to people who live on autopilot. Small talk isn't polite to you. It's theft. Theft of focus, theft of momentum, theft of the mental space you need to think clearly. So you withdraw, not in anger, but in self-preservation. You start choosing rooms carefully, limiting access, protecting mornings, guarding evenings, and saying no without apology. This choice can look arrogant from the outside, but internally it feels like relief, like finally stopping a slow leak you ignored for years. You notice your thinking sharpen, your energy stabilize, and your patience return once the noise fades away. Fewer conversations create space for better ones, and emptiness becomes a filter instead of a punishment, shaping your environment slowly over time. This creates alignment, not isolation, clarity, not bitterness, momentum, not stagnation long-term. This pattern doesn't make you superior. It makes you incompatible with environments built for distraction. Comment depth if you've ever felt drained just from being social, because naming this pattern explains why being around people can feel lonelier than being alone, and why choosing fewer conversations is sometimes the only way to protect your clarity and your future. Pattern 3 hurts because it turns social life into a pressure chamber you can feel before anyone names it. You don't hate people, you hate coercion, especially the quiet kind that hides behind smiles and jokes. Group dynamics often operate like soft tyrannies, with unspoken rules enforced through approval and exclusion. Agree with us. Laugh when we laugh, dislike who we dislike, or feel the temperature drop. When someone says, "We all think this way," or "Everyone hates that person," your body stiffens. Not because you want conflict, but because your autonomy is being tested. Most friend groups are not built on honesty. They are built on alignment. The goal is emotional uniformity, not truth. If you deviate, even quietly, you become a problem that needs correcting. You've felt this in small moments that others brush off. A friend asks why you didn't show up. But the question isn't curiosity, it's surveillance. A group decision is presented as inevitable, and disagreement is framed as betrayal. You notice how affection is given conditionally, how warmth disappears when you stop nodding. This creates an allergic reaction in you. Your nervous system reads it as a threat. You cannot relax in environments where agreement is mandatory. You start asking questions instead of offering compliance. Why do we believe this? Why does that person bother you so much? Why does disagreement feel dangerous here? Why is the most dangerous word to a fragile ego? Those questions don't make you popular. They make you inconvenient. Groups label you difficult, arrogant, or negative, not because you dominate, but because you won't submit. You don't mirror the group mood on command. You don't perform outrage when told. You don't outsource your thinking to consensus. As a result, you become harder to manipulate. Social pressure loses its leverage when it stops working on you. That loss terrifies people who rely on control to feel safe. They respond the only way they know how, by pushing you out or quietly sidelining you. This is where isolation begins to feel intentional rather than accidental. You didn't drift away. You were filtered out. Machiavelli warned about this kind of pressure. He understood that groups punish independence faster than incompetence. Once you see this pattern, past breakups and distancing moments make sense. The friend group that dissolved after you stopped agreeing. The social circle that faded when you refused to take sides. The workplace clique that cooled when you asked for reasoning instead of reassurance. You weren't rejected for being cruel. You were rejected for being uncontrollable. This trait costs you comfort, but it protects your sovereignty. It keeps you from trading your mind for belonging. Over time, you stop craving acceptance that requires self-betrayal. You learn that being alone is less damaging than being owned. This realization reshapes your relationships permanently. It also explains why your circle keeps shrinking without drama. Freedom rarely gathers crowds, it creates distance first. That distance is not failure, it is the cost of remaining intact. Pattern 4 creates a quieter kind of distance, because your mind is rarely where everyone else is standing. While others say just enjoy the moment, your attention keeps drifting forward, scanning consequences, trajectories, and outcomes. This habit gets mislabeled quickly. People call you paranoid, anxious, or a buzzkill, not because you ruin fun, but because you refuse to ignore the cost of today's choices. Your brain operates on temporal displacement. It doesn't stay anchored in the present. It moves ahead automatically. You see habits forming while others see harmless routines. You see patterns compounding while others see isolated moments. When someone says it's just one night, just one drink, just one delay, your mind quietly projects 10 years forward. You picture the relationship that never recovered, the career that stalled, the health that eroded slowly. This doesn't feel dramatic to you. It feels obvious. The problem is that foresight isolates. At a table full of people chasing relief, you're thinking about direction. When friends laugh at an idea, you see the version of it that could work with time and discipline. When a coworker mocks a risk, you notice the window closing. This creates friction. You sound serious when others want escape. You seem distant when others want distraction. Think of the friend group planning another weekend with no plan beyond surviving Monday, while you're calculating how many years that cycle steals. Or the person joking about debt, burnout, or stagnation, while your mind is already counting the interest. They live in the night. You live in the outcome. That difference makes connection hard. You cannot fully relax in spaces where tomorrow is treated as optional. Over time, you stop trying to explain yourself. Because explanation sounds like judgment, you withdraw instead. This withdrawal gets misread as coldness, when it is really alignment. You are not rejecting people. You are protecting a future version of yourself that already feels real. This trait often develops early, sometimes from watching adults repeat mistakes, sometimes from paying a price for ignoring warning signs once. Either way, your nervous system learned that anticipation is safer than repair. Living this way is heavy, but it is also strategic. You trade short-term comfort for long-term control. The cost is social ease. The benefit is trajectory. Once you accept this, you stop apologizing for caring about where things lead. You realize that not everyone can walk beside you when you are already living several steps ahead. When that solitude is sometimes the only space where long-term thinking can breathe, without interference, without losing yourself. Pattern 5 is the one people feel before they understand, and that is why it attracts hostility without explanation. You walk into rooms, say very little, do nothing provocative, and still sense resistance forming. People seem irritated by your presence, threatened by your calm, unsettled by the fact that you are fine without them. This is not arrogance. It is an autotelic personality. Your motivation does not come from applause, validation, or constant feedback. You generate momentum internally. When others are ignored, they spiral. When you are ignored, you continue. That difference is disruptive in a social economy built on attention. Most people run on external fuel. Compliments, agreement, reassurance, belonging. Remove those inputs and they destabilize. You don't. You still read, build, train, think, and move forward. That independence quietly removes leverage. Social pressure works by threatening exclusion. Approval is offered as currency, and silence is used as punishment. But what happens when neither works on you? What happens when you don't chase praise and don't fear distance? The dynamic collapses. This is why people test you. They withhold warmth, delay replies, create subtle slights, hoping you will reach out, explain yourself, or seek re-entry. When you don't, confusion turns into resentment. Think of a workplace where recognition is handed out strategically. When others are overlooked, they perform harder. When you are overlooked, you keep producing. Or the social group that freezes someone out to restore hierarchy. Others panic. You don't flinch. No one can control you with social pressure because you are not dependent on it. That makes you unpredictable. And unpredictability makes insecure systems aggressive. This is where Machiavelli becomes explicit. Machiavelli believed the most dangerous person is the one who needs nothing. Not because they dominate, but because they cannot be bought, threatened, or steered. That kind of autonomy destabilizes people who rely on leverage to feel powerful, so they attack the character instead. You are called aloof, arrogant, unlikable, cold. These labels are attempts to regain control, to make you want approval again. But the truth is simpler. You are not playing the same game. Your satisfaction comes from alignment, not applause. Much, you value sovereignty over acceptance. That choice costs you warmth, but it protects your agency. Over time, this pattern filters your circle aggressively. Only people who don't need to own you can stay close. Everyone else drifts away, offended by your lack of hunger. You are punished for not needing approval because need is the glue that holds many groups together. When you remove it, the structure cracks. A person who needs nothing cannot be controlled. This is the psychological peak where isolation stops feeling accidental and starts feeling inevitable. Because power that cannot be negotiated forces separation. And separation exposes who wanted access to you, not connection, or shared growth over time. Comment sovereign if you've ever been punished just for not needing approval. Because naming this pattern reveals why your independence attracts friction, and why your solitude often begins the moment others realize they have no leverage over you anymore. Moreover, by this point it is tempting to turn solitude into a badge of honor. But this is where things can slide into self-destruction if you are not careful. Isolation can protect clarity, but it can also quietly rot judgment when it goes unchecked. The danger is not being alone. The danger is what loneliness pressures you to accept. When the silence stretches too long, standards begin to soften. You start telling yourself that some connection is better than none, that temporary warmth is worth long-term damage. This is how people like you end up in half-relationships, situationships, and low-grade friendships that drain more than they give. You know the type. The person who texts only when bored, the group that tolerates you but never really respects you, the conversations that leave you emptier than before. These connections feel better than nothing for a moment, then worse than solitude afterward. Another risk is running back to the herd just to quiet the void. You laugh at jokes you don't find funny. You agree with opinions you don't believe. You shrink your curiosity and dull your edge to earn a seat at the table. This is not belonging, it is camouflage. And camouflage always comes at a cost. The more you wear the mask, the heavier it becomes. The loneliness of the mask is heavier than the loneliness of the cave. There is also the temptation to romanticize isolation itself, to tell yourself you are above human need. That story sounds strong, but it is brittle. Humans still require resonance, not crowds, but alignment. The goal is not permanent exile, it is selective connection. Think of the friend you kept around out of habit, or the group you stayed in out of fear of starting over. Each compromise trained your nervous system to confuse relief with safety. This is where self-awareness matters. Solitude should sharpen you, not harden you. It should be a space for rebuilding standards, not abandoning them. If you feel yourself reaching for connection that costs your values, pause. That pull is not weakness, it is hunger. And hunger makes people eat garbage. The solution is not to starve forever or binge on whatever is available. It is to tolerate the quiet long enough to remember what nourishment actually feels like. And to trust that empty space is not an emergency, it is a filter. If solitude is going to stay in your life, then it has to become a laboratory, not a sentence. This is where strategy replaces coping. Now, the first direction is standards. You do not lower them to escape discomfort. You clarify them to survive it. Standards are not demands placed on others. They are filters you apply to yourself. Who gets access to your time? Who hears your real thoughts? Who benefits from your energy? When standards stay firm, emptiness stops feeling like failure and starts feeling like discipline. The second direction is becoming a beacon instead of a seeker. You do not chase connection. You build signal. You work, learn, train, think, and refine in silence. Over time, that focus emits something recognizable. People who are aligned don't need convincing. They feel it. This is why the right connections often arrive quietly, through shared work, shared pressure, shared direction, not social effort. The third direction is learning to wear a social mask without letting it fuse to your face. This is survival, not deception. You smile when appropriate. You engage lightly when needed. You talk about weather, sports, or weekends without revealing your inner world. You don't correct everyone. You don't expose every inconsistency. You understand timing. Truth delivered at the wrong moment is wasted power. Disguise is not lying, it is pacing. You protect your core by not broadcasting it. This balance matters. Too much openness drains you. Too much isolation hardens you. Timing determines whether solitude sharpens or isolates. Think of it like moving through the hostile terrain. You don't charge openly. You observe. You choose moments. You conserve energy until it counts. Power grows in silence. That silence is where you build leverage, clarity, and patience. Over time, solitude stops feeling like absence and starts feeling like preparation. You notice that you speak less, but mean more. You react slower, but decide better. You stop explaining yourself to people who never intended to understand. This is not withdrawal from life. It is calibration. Survival is not about disappearing. It is about staying intact long enough to choose where and how you engage. When you treat solitude as a controlled environment instead of a wound, it stops bleeding you. It becomes a place where identity stabilizes and direction sharpens. And when you eventually step back into connection, you do so without hunger, without masks you resent, and without the need to be accepted at the cost of your judgment. Having few friends is not a flaw. It is a cost. And costs always point to value. Throughout this video, you have seen that isolation did not come from incompetence or cruelty. It came from awareness, autonomy, and depth colliding with environments built for comfort and conformity. You were not filtered out because you failed. You were filtered because you would not dilute yourself to stay included. Machiavelli understood this without apology. He believed power begins with seeing people clearly, without romance and without resentment. That clarity makes you harder to manipulate, harder to herd, and harder to use, which is why it often results in distance first. This is not bitterness, it is adulthood earned. Solitude is the tax you pay for freedom. Not everyone is meant to sit at your table. The mistake is not being alone. The mistake is thinking aloneness must be cured immediately. When you rush to belong, you trade judgment for warmth. When you wait, you keep your standards intact. This is the part Machiavelli was never afraid to say out loud. If you understand human nature, you do not need to dominate it. You only need to stop being naive about it. You learn when to speak, when to stay silent, when to blend, and when to walk away without burning bridges or begging for seats that were never built for you. This perspective makes you precise. It allows you to choose relationships instead of falling into them. It allows you to value alignment over applause and timing over impulse. If this resonated, Comment the mask no longer works on me, not as a declaration of superiority, but as a commitment to clarity. And subscribe if you want to understand people without being naive.